Okay, folks, I think we'll get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Jess Blythe to our seminar this week. Jess is originally from Newfoundland in Canada, and appropriately she worked on juvenile cod behaviour in her undergrad. But after spending some time working in Africa, she moved over to the social sciences for her master's and PhD. Her PhD was based in Mozambique, working in rural fishing communities there. And Jess is going to talk to us a bit about that work initially, and then about the work she's doing here at the centre. So Jess is got a co-funded or a joint position between the Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies and the World Fish Centre, which is based in Penang, Malaysia. She's going to be giving us a bit of a flavour of the work she's starting to do with world fish and the Solomons. Thanks, Jess.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Nick. I'm Jessica Blythe. I'm about a year into my postdoc here with the Centre and half with World Fish as well. And at the Centre, I'm under Program 5 with Terry, which is the resilience of social ecological systems. And just for some added drama before I start my talk, the day I was born, my dad, who's a marine biologist, was scheduled to give a seminar at his department, and my mom went into labor and they had to cancel the talk. So we'll see how we go. So I'd like to start by situating my talk within a history of some big fisheries papers and the impact that they had on perceptions of fisheries on marine ecosystems. So jumping in 1998, a really famous paper, Daniel Pauly and all published, Fishing Down Marine Food Webs in Science. And this paper had really enormous impact. Based on catch data that's provided to the FAO, they showed that mean trophic levels on the y-axis have been declining since the start of industrial fishing in the 1950s, essentially showing that we're fishing down through all the top predatory species towards jellyfish, and the paper gave rise to the powerful concept of the jellyfish burger, which was aided, no doubt, by this image produced by one of Pauly's students, which won an honorable mention in the New York Times Visualizing Science category. Next, in 2001, Jeremy Jackson and colleagues, including Terry, published Historical Overfishing and Recent Collapse of Coastal Systems in Science magazine. And this is a paper that's been cited almost 4,000 times. Essentially what their paper is arguing is by the time we started looking at industrial fishing impacts in the 1950s, humans had already altered marine ecosystems so much that our perception of what a healthy ecosystem looked like is quite distorted. So, for example, in 1901 in Newfoundland, where I grew up, this is the sort of size of cod that fishermen could expect. And by the time I got around to fishing for cod in 2013, this is sort of the average size. So this is sometimes referred to as the shifting baseline syndrome. This paper as well had really big impact on public perceptions of impact of fishing on ecosystems. So next, in 2003, Ram Myers and Boris Worm put out Rapid Worldwide Depletion of Predatory Fish Communities in Nature in a paper that received massive media coverage. The paper essentially argued that the biomass of the large predatory fish in the ocean have been reduced to 10% of their pre-industrial levels. Got massive media coverage, like the cover of Time magazine here, and had, again, a really big impact on public perception of the impact of fisheries. In Victoria, BC, where I did my PhD studies, if you even think about eating tuna sushi, you will be like kicked off the island. It was really big impacts on what we're doing to marine ecosystems. So finally, and perhaps one of the heaviest hitters is this paper, which is infamously known as the 2048 paper. Boris Worm and all published Impacts of Biodiversity Loss on Ocean Ecosystems in Science in 2006. The paper made the cover of the New York Times. It was on the BBC Evening News, amongst others. And essentially what it projected is that if we continue fishing at the exploitation rates that we are, all fish taxa will be gone by 2048. So some of these papers are pretty controversial. One of the complicated things about measuring the impacts of fisheries on marine systems is we can't go and count all the fish. So we rely on different types of data. And whether you're a believer in catch data as our most close proxy or abundance data, the messages that are coming out of these papers are quite clear. But the thing is, the majority of the robust data sets that we have are for developed countries, and they're often for commercial fisheries. So the message that was coming out, which is essentially that fishing is bad, I think simplifies the picture. So what I argue is that concern about overfishing and the ecological costs of aquaculture dominate popular and research narratives about the sustainability of marine resources, while the more utilitarian role of fish as a direct provider to poor, vulnerable, or food insecure populations is conspicuously undervalued. So I want to go through a few of the columns in this graph which compares commercial fisheries to small-scale fisheries, and there's quite a stark difference between the two. In the top row here, you've got the number of fishermen employed. In the commercial fishery, it's somewhere in the ballpark of 2 million fishers employed, whereas in the small-scale sector, it's over 30 million. And when you add on top of that close to 75 million post-harvest jobs, many of which are occupied by women, the number grows to over 100 million people directly employed by the fishery. Next row down is the total catch, and they're comparable. So around 40 million tons annually caught by both the commercial and the small-scale fishery. But the big difference is that developing countries in Asia and Africa and the Pacific have a much higher dependence on fish for their animal protein than do the developed countries. So building on that point, if you jump down a few rows to the marine fish caught for industrial reduction into meal and fish oil, almost 15 tons of the fish caught by the commercial sector gets reduced for those non-food purposes, whereas almost none of the 40 million caught is used for non-food purposes in the small sector. Another interesting comparative one is the bycatch discards. It's far lower for the small-scale fishery. So in commercial fisheries, you're often targeting the high-value catches, and anything that's not a shrimp or a tuna can be tossed, whereas almost all of those so-called fish are used as food sources by small-scale fisheries. Where I worked in Mozambique, the fishermen would literally row their boats out to big shrimp trawlers, and they would buy bycatch that was going to be dumped overboard to take into local food markets. So the important point here is that small-scale fisheries make more efficient use of marine resources, and they contribute more directly to both livelihoods and food security of hundreds of millions of people in the developing world. And for these people, I think it's really fishing is life. It's not a destructive practice that just strips the ocean of its top predators, but it's that sort of underemphasized part of the story that I'm interested in. So I think that social science has a lot to contribute to that part of the story. One of the reasons I think that small-scale fisheries are underemphasized in these larger fisheries narratives is that they're notoriously underreported. Some of the reasons for this are they're often marginalized because they make very small contributions to GDP. They're often very geographically remote, so they're difficult to get to. And they're quite spatially distributed. So, for example, in a commercial scale fishery, you might have one port where 10 or 20 vessels come, and it's relatively easy to monitor that catch. But in a small scale fishery, you may have a dozen ports that are home to, thousands of ships that it just makes monitoring and reporting of that data much more costly, much more difficult. So, given their access, social scientists could be collecting reliable catch data for underreported small-scale fisheries. And given their access, meaning that social scientists often work for long periods of time in one location, and they develop strong relationships with local fishers, so they might have access to that type of data which we're missing at the global scale. Next, I think that social scientists are well positioned to document not only the changes that ecosystems are having on fishers' lives, but also how fishers are responding, or how people are responding to those changes. And that's an important piece of the story as well. And then finally, drawing on social theory, social scientists can propose and test methods of social behaviors of sufficient generality to be useful for marine resource policy making. So these are some of the areas where I aim to make contributions with my research. And now we'll move into some of it. So 2 countries I'm going to talk about today. The first is Mozambique, and this is wrapping up the end of my PhD work and some of the stuff I've been working on since I arrived here. I began working in Mozambique in 2009, and I was new to the country, and I thought, because I'm interested in small-scale fisheries, the most appropriate place to start would be looking at total catch and landings data. I wanted to see what was happening and what had been happening over time. So this is the available landings data for Mozambique. Along the left side of the y-axis is the catch in tons per year, and on the right side are the number of fishers and collectors, and that's what's in the line graph there. So the general trend is reflective of many of the fisheries globally. You have a gradual rise starting in the 1950s up until around the mid-1980s, early 90s, followed by a decline in catch. That's all normal and relatively expected. But clearly in 2003, something strange happened to the data. And it took us a while digging to find out what that was. And what it turns out is prior to 2003, catch was only for the commercial scale. But starting in 2003, the government found the resources to start collecting and reporting catch for the small-scale fishery. So that's a really big deal for a couple of reasons. The first is that the small-scale fishery in Mozambique is collecting more than 3/4 of the total catch. So they're a huge portion of the fishery in the country. Next, if you look at the number of small-scale fishers, it's been increasing dramatically. Up to the latest report is about 280,000 small-scale fishers. And when you add on top of that post-harvest jobs, there's close to 500,000 people employed in addition to those fishers by the sector. So very important sector for the country, particularly in a country where wage work, especially in the rural areas, is very limited. And then the third really important thing is that even though this is such a big part of the fishery and it's employing so many people, we don't have very much data for it. Prior to 2003, there's none. So what we decided to do is talk with fishermen. So fortunately, they've been there. They've been fishing throughout their careers, many for 20, 30, 40 years, and we can go and interview them. So that's what we did. One of the things that we had our fishers do was estimate historical catch rates and then compare those to current rates. And what we found is that historical rates were significantly higher than current catch rates. And when you compare this to, there's one catch reconstruction that's been done, it does look like when you extrapolate backwards, the trend for the small-scale fisheries has followed the commercial scale, that being the peak around the mid-1980s and the subsequent decline in catch. So catches are declining in the country. An interesting kind of anecdote, when we're talking about data sources and their reliability, for anybody uncomfortable with what can be called anecdotal data, whenever we speak with our fishermen, we always try and compare it or triangulate it with other sources of data. So for example, fishers tell us that their rainfall has been decreasing, and that's been contributing to the lower fish catch rates. And so we're able to compare that to meteorological data, which confirms that rainfall has been decreasing when the fishermen told us it has. And then we can compare that to peer-reviewed studies that show the relationship between rainfall and primary productivity in shores of coastal Mozambique So we don't just take fishers' word for it, but we're always triangulating it. And for the majority of the time, the data sources match up, so that gives us some confidence in that data. So not only can fishers tell us what they used to catch and help us contribute to back calculating some of these trends, they can also tell us how they respond. One of the fishers told us, when I first started fishing, we used to catch a lot of fish, not like today. After one trip, you wouldn't have to fish anymore. Today, we need 3 or 4 trips to earn enough money. So what that contributes to the story is changing efforts and increasing effort trends. Not only is it becoming harder to earn your living as a fisher because of these declining catch rates, but more fishers are entering the fishery. A fisher said, "I've seen the number of fishers increase and the number of fish decrease. Today, people who have never dreamed of becoming a fisher are fishing, and they all like to fish in the same place. So how can there be any fish left in the sea?" This is a trend which is happening in Mozambique, but it's also reflective on the global scale, is that the increase in small-scale fishers is outpacing population growth. So more people are turning to fishers, are turning to marine resources. So that, again, emphasizes the importance of the small-scale sector for livelihoods. And then finally, they can describe how they're changing their behavior. So boats used to be smaller. Now boats are 9 to 10 meters, and we fish with gill nets that can go deep in the ocean. So in the picture in the bottom there's a dugout canoe in the back, which is 2 to 3 meters and used to be the primary fishing vessel. But now they're increasing their boat sizes, increasing their net sizes to try and compensate for a declining catch. And that will obviously have a big impact on the fishery. Another thing is that when fishers change their behavior, they're often compensating for declining catch rates. They're exposing themselves to more risky behavior. So one of the things that happened in the community I was working with, just a few weeks before I arrived for my second trip, a boat like this black one in the front was out in the open ocean where they're not used to fishing and they're not really equipped for the high seas. There's also been increasing storm severity related to climate change in Mozambique, and fishers are drowning. So there was a boat like this with 20 fishermen that were lost just before I arrived for my second data collection trip, and it really sort of is indicative of that vulnerability of coastal livelihoods. So that transitions us into vulnerability of coastal livelihoods, and a second question which I decided to explore while I was there was whether or not aquaculture can be a suitable alternative or complement to small-scale fishing because the catches are declining. So in the community where I worked, there's a large-scale export-oriented shrimp farm which produces tiger shrimp for export to high-end European markets, primarily in France. It's there in the white dashed line, so you can get a feel for it. It's large-scale. It's been in the community for about 10 years producing shrimp, and they employ close to 300 local people. It's a community where there's essentially no other wage option, so I wanted to look at how that was affecting people's livelihoods, whether it was good or bad, essentially. What we did was interview people that worked at the farm and interviewed people from the community that didn't work at the farm, and we looked at the 3 components of vulnerability that's usually described as exposure to stressors, sensitivity to those stressors, and adaptive capacity. So, what we found is that exposure to stressors between the 2 groups, and that's farm employees in black and non-farm employees in gray, the exposure was relatively similar, and that makes sense to me because they all live in the same communities. So the big stressors that people are dealing with are disease, that's human diseases. Cholera is a really big problem. Malaria, AIDS is a problem in these communities, or this one community I'm working in. Drought is also affecting over 80% of all the households that we worked in. So mostly, rural livelihoods are quite diversified, and almost everybody has a small subsistence garden. And so when there's drought and changing climatic conditions, this creates stressors on people's livelihoods. And importantly, as well as lack of food, 80% of all the households we surveyed have reported food insecurity during the previous 12 months. So these are some of the multiple stresses that people are dealing with. It's never just singularly related to the marine resource sector, which I'm always interested in. So then we got people to tell us, in response to those stressors, what do you do? How do you respond? And what kind of strategies do you employ? So again, taking less food was the most commonly employed strategy by both groups, both farm employees and not. And I think that that's an important counter to the narrative that often accompanies shrimp farming or aquaculture of any sort, which is it'll improve food security and it'll improve income. But what we found is that even though people are earning a wage, they're still struggling to meet their bare minimum daily food requirements. The shrimp from the farm that I'm working with is export only, so it's not even available for local purchase. But the purchasing power, because of their extra income, was still not enough to offset these sort of food insecurity issues. The good news, as part of the story, is that there were strategies available to farm employees that weren't available to the rest of the community. So the second row down, taking extra work at the farm, over half of the people that I interviewed would do that to cope with times of stress. So that was helpful. Use of savings was much higher by farm employees, and that was primarily because they had more savings. They had little nest eggs that they could draw on if someone became sick or there was a damage to their crop or to their house. And down closer to the bottom is taking a loan from the farm. Small-scale credit is often really important to help people get through those periods of stress. And the farm actually lends or gives advances on salaries to farm employees, which was helpful in this case. So when we came away from our first data collection period for this particular piece of research, we thought, okay, maybe even though I went in assuming that the farm is the bad guy, it was actually helping people in some of these ways. So perhaps it reduced vulnerability of people's livelihoods. However, nothing ever stays the same. And 6 months after I got back from my data collection trip, the white spot virus hit Mozambique for the first time. It had never been in the country before. It was new on the east coast of Africa. And essentially, within a matter of days, all the shrimp in the farm were killed. All of the employees were laid off. And so what this incident demonstrated is that while the shrimp farm did strengthen the adaptive capacities of their employees, it also exposed them to a shock that they weren't exposed to before. And this type of threshold event can be really damaging. Some of the farm employees hadn't invested as much in their subsistence gardens, and they weren't prepared because they were now reliant on the monthly income that was coming in. So it shows that these types of livelihoods are vulnerable to shocks and to these sort of big events. So that leads me into the third piece of research in Mozambique, which is looking at social thresholds. It's a aspect of the research I'm really interested in. Everybody in this room is familiar with the idea of thresholds and regime shifts. Famously, you could have a healthy coral reef where perhaps a lot of the herbivorous fish are overfished, and other stressors like climate change or bleaching events causes a shift in the system where it shifts from a desirable state into an undesirable state. Or the other temperate example that's very well known is the kelp forest, where perhaps otters are taken out, the sea urchin population grows, and that system shifts. So while we're increasingly viewing these types of systems as social and ecological, and we recognize that the human dimensions of regional and global regime shifts are important, I argue that in comparison to ecological thresholds, we understand remarkably little about social thresholds and whether that's even a thing or whether it's something we can measure. So it's something that I wanted to investigate in my research communities, particularly given the type of experience we'd had with the shrimp farm and those types of quick shifts. So what I did was worked with two fishing communities that I had been working with for several years. First, we had them define the identity of their system. So that's the resilience of what part of the question. And what they told us is that it's fishing and that relationship between fishers and fish that defines their communities. That's really the central identity. So then what we had them do was tell us what are the biggest drivers of change that are threatening that identity. And in the communities that I was working in, it's declining fish catch. So that's the resilience of what is the fishing community to what is declining fish catch. So how we got about, or how we went about actually measuring this was to have fishers tell us how they would respond to hypothetical declines in catch. So on the y-axis is percent respondents and how they would react to a particular decline. And Z and I is the two communities where I was working in. Z is Zalala Beach and I is in Yangomi. So in this diagram, continuing to fish is represented in blue. And importantly, that's the desirable state for these communities. That's where they want to be. They want to continue fishing. And what you'll see is that as the severity of catch decline increases, more and more fishers will have to exit the fishery. So let me see. Yeah, so what we decided is that if fishers continue fishing, the relationship between fish and fishers is maintained and that system maintains its identity. But when fishers would leave the fishery, that relationship would be broken and that would represent a threshold in these cases. So the tricky thing is that we're asking individual fishers to tell us how they would respond, but we're interested in the system of a community as a collective. So what we did was sit down in focus groups and ask fishers to define when a threshold would be reached for their community. And what they told us is that when more than half of the fishers in their community would stop fishing, that would represent a regime shift for their system. That would be the point at which that system would have lost its identity and it would become something qualitatively different. So one of the good things about working with people as opposed to just ecological systems is you can ask them what they would do in response to a regime shift. It's more difficult with the marine organisms. So a really interesting part of the research is that the two communities would respond quite differently in response to this shift. Zalala Beach has a history of migration, so most fishers have moved from elsewhere to fish there. And they said once we hit that threshold, we'll leave and we'll follow the fish and we'll go to another community. But in Yangomi, these fishers have been in their community for many generations and they said this is our home. There was a really strong sense of attachment to place. And they said if the fish are gone, we can't leave. This is where we belong, but we'll have to switch into alternate livelihoods. So it's very interesting data and I think useful kind of empirical data for fisheries governance, because we could identify the desirable state, so we get at that sort of subjective decisions of resilience for whom. We could have fishers tell us where that threshold lies and when they would change their behavior, and also how they would change their behavior. So I think it generates some important empirical data for fisheries governance. So moving on to the second portion of my talk, it's based in the Solomon Islands, and it's some of the work that I've been doing since I arrived here at the center. One of the exciting parts has been that I've been able to move from asking questions about the problem. So we've got declining catch, we've got really vulnerable livelihoods, and now we're moving into some questions about addressing that problem with some of my colleagues at World Fish, which has been really nice shift. So in regards to addressing the fisheries problem, In many settings, immediate steps towards solving the fisheries crisis may lie outside of the fisheries sector itself. So, for example, shrimp farm employees in Mozambique can't benefit from the income they get from their job if they're dealing with cholera or malaria and they're not able to actually get to work. So issues relating to public health, local governance, social safety nets, or other broader rural development may need to be prioritized first instead of just focusing on the marine resource issues. So World Fish is an international research organization. They're committed to strengthening the livelihoods of people in coastal communities through fisheries and aquaculture, but with the understanding that these types of livelihoods are embedded in broader socio-political and economic systems, and that often we'll need to take a broad approach to working on livelihoods in these settings. So I'm going to present two of the projects that I'm working on. The first one is with the Malaita Provincial Partners for Development. So, in response to the complexity and diversity of marine resource-based livelihoods, decentralization is often proposed as a better alternative to manage these systems. Decentralization can mean that community-based management, collaborative governments, co-management, those types of systems that devolve decision-making power from those further away from the resource to those closer to the resource. The idea is that they'll foster more sort of innovative and locally appropriate solutions to dealing with the resource issue. However, rather than serially sort of applying co-management across all systems and assuming that it will be appropriate, critical analyses, contextual analyses are required to decide on what the appropriate institutional arrangement is for a particular context. So what we're doing is working with this Provincial Partnership for Development in the Solomon Islands. So the Malaita province of Solomon Islands has got the most people out of any of the provinces. It's got the most degraded resources, and it's sort of notorious for being the hardest and roughest people, the hardest people to work with. So a lot of the marine resource issues, disputes over land tenure, they're all present in this province. So what this development partnership is in 2012, the different groups that are working all across the province decided that they needed to form a network where they could actually share and collaborate on what types of work was going on in the province. The group consists of government ministries, so the Ministry of Fisheries, Health, Gender, NGOs, so World Fish is a partner of this organization, as well as church groups, and just all the different organizations that are working in the province have come together to form this network. So clearly not all networks are created equal, and just because people are coming together in the same room doesn't mean that things are going to get better. So what we've decided to do is research this network alongside. So we're a partner of it, but we're also doing research to see if it's actually doing anything, how it's working, if it's having the impacts that it wants to. So in addition to attending all of the meetings, which are held quarterly, I've interviewed all of the members of the network, and we're going to continue working with them over the next few years. But what's coming out so far is that there is an increased sharing of information. Just the most basic things like which organization is working in which part of the province on what was information that previously people didn't have access to, and they do now. A really important one is that resources are now being shared. As an example of how sparse things can be in Malaita, the fisheries, the Provincial Fisheries Office is one office with one guy who doesn't have a computer. He sits at a desk by himself, and that's the capacity of the Provincial Fisheries Ministry. So some of the most basic things that are happening is now if someone's going to Northern Malaita, they can ask partners if anyone else is working up there, and they can share resources like a truck. A truck is an actual barrier against the type of work that people are doing. On a bigger sort of scale, the sharing of resources are things like we're realizing that gendered issues are quite important in a lot of the land disputes that are going on in communities where we work. So as an organization, we're pretty good at marine resource issues, but we're not so strong in gendered issues. So we've partnered with the Ministry for Women and Children, and we're now working together in communities. So sharing of resources across that type of scale, that's starting to happen, which is a good thing. And shared learning. From things as simply as some people told me, I now know how to give a PowerPoint presentation, so I can do that when I'm reporting back to the ministry, to things like we're learning how to engage communities when you first go into a community. It's types of best practices you can follow so you don't end up offending people right away or making mistakes that are difficult to undo. So those things are starting to happen already. Some of the challenges, there's quite variable commitment from partners. Some of the partners that I interviewed want to quit their job and work for MPPD full-time, and they're totally on board with the program. They really believe it's going to make a difference. Whereas other partners, I had to remind them what the acronym stood for. They just don't there's no engagement at all. So there's quite variable commitment to the program. Another big challenge is the sustainability of the network itself. So right now, World Fish and World Vision are the two NGOs that are sort of facilitating all of the meetings, footing the bill, those basic things like providing the meeting space. And ideally, in order for this network to actually have an impact in the province long term, it would have to be a self-sustained network that wouldn't be relying on the presence of an NGO, which could then leave and the network falls apart. So that's an issue that we want to work with. And so moving forward, it's a really unique opportunity to sort of be part of this group, but actually be doing research at the same time. So one of the things that we've done already is a workshop on theory of change, which is essentially getting the group to be specific about goals and activities and how you're actually going to move forward instead of just working towards the goal, which is a peaceful, prosperous, and healthy Malaita province. It's kind of large and lofty and maybe not that attainable. But when we break it down like this and we focus on specific tasks and who will do what activities and what outcomes are expected, we can sort of be supporting the network, and the network also articulates where it wants to go, but we do research alongside. So I think it's a bit of a neat opportunity and hopefully one with some tangible outcomes. So the last bit of work that I'm working on has to do with innovation diffusion and back to critical thresholds, because it's one of the things that's really got me fascinated these days. Innovation diffusion theory attempts to explain how new ideas and practices spread within and between communities. So the premise is that a new idea or an innovation will spread through social networks, largely based on interpersonal relationships. And one of the fascinating areas within this research is the threshold or the area between individual innovation and a critical mass where that innovation becomes adopted by a wider populace. So an example for this could be if you have a large group of people assembled for a peaceful protest and things are sort of under control, there's a variation within that crowd of individual thresholds. So some people won't require anyone else to change their behavior before they take action. And that person can be known as the instigator or the innovator if it's a good innovation. So say somebody gets up and throws a rock that breaks a window. But then other people in that crowd have variable thresholds as well. So perhaps 2 or 3 people start and then some more people join. And then there becomes a threshold point where that peaceful protest turns into a riot. And it's that type of threshold that you can study when you're looking at the diffusion of innovations. Advancing our understanding of threshold and the critical mass required is constrained by a lack of empirical data. So we've got a case that we're investigating this through, which is tilapia pond culture in Malaita province, again in the Solomon Islands. So the problem or that this is trying to address is that by 2030, it's predicted that coastal fisheries may only provide recommended fish per capita for 6 of the 22 Pacific Island countries. And Solomon Islands is one of the countries where the fish requirements are going to be deficits. They are not going to be met. So aquaculture is a priority activity for the government, and it's starting to spread throughout the province. So, one of the recommended strategies, if you want an innovation to spread, is to target a highly respected individual within that system. And as a personal example, Terry started using Twitter, and then I thought that I should start using Twitter because he's somebody in the center who is a respected individual who we often follow. In our case, the guy in this photo's name is Lionel. He's a big man in his community, and so we've decided to work specifically with him under the assumption that he might have a larger influence on other people in adopting tilapia aquaculture in the province. So Lionel has a demonstration farm. He's been given all sorts of information about tilapia farming, on building of ponds, on feed, on harvesting, and he's got that information available that he can then spread to other farmers. So we're interested in mapping the temporal and spatial spread of tilapia farming as it moves throughout the province. And the big issue is that the coastal communities often have reef tenure, so they've got access to fish, but in the center, which is the highlands, people don't have access to fish. So that's the area that we're focusing on and looking at how this farming is spreading. But in addition to just where and when tilapia culture is taking up, we're also interested in why and how that spreads. And so the really cool thing for me is when we're looking at thresholds in the ecological systems we study, and what I did in my fishing communities is we have a desirable state that we're trying to maintain, and we're trying to avoid crossing that threshold into the undesirable state. But in this type of research, we have an undesirable state, so that being fish deficit in the Highland province. And what we're interested in is how to actually go up and go over the threshold to move the system into a more desirable state. So I'm in the process right now of designing that study and how we'll actually measure what causes somebody to choose adoption, what causes somebody not to, and sort of linking the literatures. This innovation diffusion literature comes mostly from sociology and even marketing, business sort of, and linking that with the resilience literature on thresholds. I don't think people are doing that yet. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's interesting and exciting, and I'm designing it, so I'm very happy for feedback on that. So that's what's happening with the innovation diffusion research right now. And I want to finish with a story. This is Remigio. He's one of the fishermen that I worked with in Mozambique. He's being interviewed by Yolanda, one of my field assistants. Remigio was born in the capital of Mozambique just before the Civil War. So he was a young boy throughout the Civil War, and when the war finished in 1992, he was a teenager and he needed a career. So he was talking with people, and he had heard that the fishing conditions in Nyangome, halfway up the coast, were really, really excellent. So he decided to leave home, move up the coast, and learn fishing. He began fishing with a hand line and sort of slowly learned his trade. And by the time I met him in 2009, he had become one of the most successful fishermen in the community. He had 3 huge nets that he would employ other fishers to go and fish for him. He was very locally famous for having 7 wives. He has 34 children and 7 adopted children. He is a very influential and successful man within the community. But 2 years after I met him, I went back to the community and found him in a state of despair because the house where he kept his nets had been burned to the ground and they were gone. And he explained to me in the remainder of his career he would never be able to accumulate the money he needed to repurchase those nets. So now his wives were working for other people to earn money, and he was working as a fisher for guys that he would previously employ. I wanted to end with his story because it highlights to me the types of struggles and changes and learning and adaptation that characterize rural livelihoods. He'd moved, he'd adopted a new profession, changed his gear in response to ecological conditions, acquired wealth, lost wealth. And each of the fishers or farmers that we work with have a story like that. It's a highly complex system where individuals are constantly responding to and then influencing their socio-ecological system. So I'll argue that no problem we're solving is simple. In the context of declining wild catch, rising global populations, and a growing number of marine resource-dependent people, securing the sustainability of social and ecological marine resources remains very essential. And drawing on social science to incorporate fisheries issues into the broader development policy dialogues and processes offers a promising way forward to address some of these challenges. Thank you.
Anyone at UQ? We can't really hear you actually. Any questions from UQ? Any questions here? Yeah.
You said that which was one of the points in the conclusion, securing of sustainability is essential. How do you want to secure sustainability?
Well, it's too big, to deal with as an individual researcher, but examples are taking a more broad perspective than just focusing on the marine resource issue and looking at livelihood sustainability across sectors. So, for example, in the communities where I worked in, where we were looking at social thresholds, they really want to continue fishing. It's an important income source and food source, but it's also culturally very important. The fisher's identity as a fisherman is very important to that system. So I'm advocating for policies that support livelihood diversification as one small example, so people can continue fishing, but it eases a little bit of pressure off of the fishery. Yeah.
One of your first slides was sustainable fishing, and they were saying that, and they even one of them said that there are not going to be any.
No, I can bring it.
Do they actually realize that they are actually doing overfishing? Do the governments realize that what overfishing means? And if you nothing.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of presentations on this, and all of them are showing this as a means, and all of them are showing that quite soon, in generation of hours, there won't be any fish anymore. Do the people realize? Are they ready to do something about? Are they doing something about it?
Well, that's a big question too.
All you talk about is it's important for the people, but people are overpopulated there.
Yeah, it's not so much in my mind, and this is up for debate, but it's not so much if people are ready, but if they're actually able to do something about it.
But
so
they need to do it in 20, 30, 40 years. They have to, because there will be no fish.
Yeah. It's just that if you have a household daily food requirement, it's difficult to argue 20, 30, 40 years from now.
Well, then your kids won't have what to eat.
But they need it today, so that becomes
then
difficult.
Then they will die when they are 30 years old.
Yeah. They do know. They know. They're very much aware of it. They're more aware of it than anyone else because they see it on a daily basis, and they know it's overfishing. They know it's bigger boats and bigger nets. They know when they get loans for better fishing equipment that also leads to faster decline.
But they are investing into better fishing equipment and teaching their kids to fish.
Yeah.
And that's wrong.
Well,
that means that they are not realizing that this is what is key to the fish. So,
Okay. Are there any other questions?
Just curious, are the fishers themselves, have they got other options and other livelihood in aquaculture? I mean, even here, we have people say they should stop commercial fishing and go into aquaculture. The individual fishers themselves, can't imagine them.
Yeah.
They can't imagine themselves doing it. Are they, it's on a community scale, it's a good solution, but
Yeah.
what are the individuals going to do?
That's it. I guess the optimist in me sees their diversified livelihoods as something that is good. So nobody's exclusively a fisher. They always are doing subsistence gardening. They're doing charcoal making. They're doing bicycle taxi. You know, there's always multiple things going on. But the preference is always fishing, and it's just as you said too. Nobody's ever interested in switching to aquaculture. So non-fishing livelihood interest is higher in aquaculture than the fisher's interest is ever in aquaculture. So that's one of the reasons I think it's taking hold in the highlands in Malaita, because they're not fishers, they don't have that identity, so aquaculture seems like a more interesting alternative. But yeah, it's the big challenge, I suppose.
Yeah. There's a lady I met a few years ago who's trying to implement small-scale, like family-size aquaculture in Thailand as well. Go up and send you the details.
Yeah.
But it's,
That'd be awesome. Yeah.
I was quite interested by the your vulnerability analysis of the shrimp farming. So you didn't put anything up for sensitivity. Did you look at that?
Yeah, and that was the trickiest bit that you just showed. In terms of sensitivity, what I found in the vulnerability literature is it's the least well defined on how you actually measure it. So I followed Josh and some of probably your work as well, which looked at primary livelihood and then how much that was affected by the stressors. So if you were a farmer, you were more affected by drought, or if you were an aquaculture employee, you were more sensitive to production-related shocks.
Yeah.
But that was the trickiest bit to analyze, and yeah.
And do you know what's happened to all the guys that actually worked at that farm?
Yeah, it's interesting because it says in that news report that 80 people were fired, but I know that more than 300 people were let go. And then they say that they have been re-given jobs in sort of other, like they're meddling in crab culture and stuff, but I know from reports on the ground that they haven't been rehired yet. So as up until now, they're not back at work.
And they were mostly sort of totally reliant on that industry, were they?
Yeah,
alternative.
And it's so vulnerable now that the white spot virus is there. They know it will come back and it will reemerge in the population. So it's not very good. Yeah.
All right, if there's no other questions, I think we might thank Jess again for a great talk.
Thank you.